I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing a subject which could not be more global, namely the pandemic of the coronavirus, and in particular, its impact on the political systems employed in different parts of the world, and testing this hypothesis, which happens to be my own, but may not be, with the three distinguished experts I have in the studio with me, and a few on Skype too. And it is this, that the so-called liberal democracies, the capitalist countries in the western part of the world, but also in some others, have particularly failed to rise to the challenge of the pandemic, and indeed structurally could have done no other than fail to meet the existential challenge of a totally unprecedented, certainly in modern history, a totally unprecedented challenge to the people and the society. It seems to me, I can be challenged, that the political system in China, for example, is the reason why China was able to rise to the challenge of the coronavirus. It was able to, because of its strong central state apparatus, to respond in a way that other countries, Western liberal democracies, were not able to. It was able to, with its command economy, move people and resources around in a way which in the United States, for example, is brazenly, obviously, not possible. In fact, the United States seems to be collapsing under the weight of being the world's biggest victim of this virus. The stresses and strains of its often applauded constitution are now actually laying bare contradictions within the US political system, which may have very profound and long-lasting consequences. States are no longer obeying the federal government and its head, the President, Donald Trump. Mayors of great cities are openly defying the governors of their own states, and all of them are utterly failing to marshal the resources that are needed because of the political and economic system that they are a part of. In Britain, we have had 40 years of privatization and austerity, and the national healthcare system, the NHS, has been allowed to rot, to wither on the vine. And now that this challenge has come along, are blatantly, obviously, not up to challenging it, defeating it, or even protecting the most vulnerable people, despite the enormous efforts, Herculean efforts of healthcare workers in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Britain, and in the United States. The battle is not yet, at least, being won, and the possibility of deaths on a scale not seen since the Middle Ages and the great plagues of that period is possible. Imagine, in 2020. And so I'm putting the thesis to my guests and challenging you, the audience, with this question. Is the capitalist liberal democratic model actually even able, conceptually, is it able by definition to rise to existential challenges like this? I pray and aid only one other piece of evidence. The Second World War required the abandonment of not just certain, indeed many, civil liberties and politics as usual, but required the abandonment of the capitalist model itself. Only the state could wage total war, which was sadly necessary to defeat the challenge of Hitler and fascism in the 1939-45 period. So I'm joined by my guests here, just three of them today, but three of the most formidable arguers, debaters on this subject at this time. Jerry Downing, let me start with you. You are a socialist on, if you don't mind me saying so, on the far left of British politics. What's your take on this, if you like, conceptual question? Are liberal democracies, is the capitalist world, particularly ill-suited to meeting this challenge?
Well, I have to agree with you there. Indeed, if we look at what's happened in the United States and what's about to happen in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I think it's going to be an appalling catastrophe. It's clear now that the coronavirus is running through the population. The death rate in New York is absolutely going through the roof. And the governor there has made it clear that this will now run through every city in the United States. Donald Trump is talking about a death rate of between 100,000 and 250,000. And he says if he brings it down to 100,000, that will be a victory. There couldn't be a more obvious condemnation of the social values of neoliberal capitalism than that statement. China's death rate was 3,600. And it ran through the neoliberal economies of Western Europe, Italy, Spain and France very rapidly. And it ran through, and it is running through Britain at the moment. Germany is different, and so is South Korea and Taiwan, because they mobilized their central state forces and their state, and they had not decimated their health service to the same degree as these had. But it will by far and away be the United States that's going to show us the values of neoliberal capitalism. In our view, what is going to happen in the United States is absolutely appalling. It won't be just the coronavirus. 9.6 million people have lost their jobs in the last 2 weeks in the United States. And this unemployment, with no proper welfare state, with no proper health insurance for the people that lose their jobs, is going to be an appalling catastrophe.
Because healthcare benefits are usually a package with the job. When you lose the job, you lose the healthcare benefits.
You lose the healthcare benefits. So the position of the unemployed is going to be absolutely shocking. On the other hand, I don't see the system in China as the answer to the problem. What I see happening in Britain in particular at the moment, I see two countervailing tendencies developing. I see a central state that is grabbing powers that it must have to stop the virus, but powers that it will be very reluctant to concede when this is over, because they will face a major upsurge from the working class. And I see people who were the scum of the earth 3 months ago now being hailed as the heroes of the situation. So I have a different view of a communist society. I have a view of a communist society that was put forward at the time of the Russian Revolution, that it will come from below, and it will come by an upsurge of the most oppressed that will gather around it the other sections of the middle class, etc., and that will bring us a new society.
Jonathan, you're not a socialist. You're not on the far left of British politics. You're a Liberal Democrat. But do you at least see anything in my thesis, if you like, and perhaps the United States being the best example of it, the exemplar of the free market capitalist way of doing things. And yet will very shortly, I mean, perhaps by the time this goes out, have a rate of unemployment higher than it did in the Great Depression.
Yes, I mean, obviously there is a problem in the American model of so-called liberal democracy, which is quite different from the party to which I belong. But I think really we need to focus on the issue of inequality, because for me, that is what is really being pushed forward by what's happening with COVID-19, and the way that it's the lower earners who are being hit hardest. It's the people who are losing their job at the bottom end of the so-called social scale. And in America, of course, there isn't the provision. And when we do still have the National Health Service in this country, but it has suffered from underfunding from conservative governments. And also we have to say that because of Brexit, thousands of doctors and nurses from other EU member states left the country because they no longer felt welcome or that their future was here. So the system is under enormous strain. But it is interesting, I think, how different countries are approaching the situation in different ways. Germany's already been mentioned, and I think we can learn lessons from that. And we are now in a situation where people are having to confront something which is indeed like a wartime situation, where some doctors are saying it's already happening. There'll be some circumstances where they have to decide, who shall we save? If there's so many intensive care beds or there's so many ventilators and not enough, does that mean then we have to choose who can live and who can die? And that I find, as a Liberal Democrat, very alarming indeed.
Well, it's alarming when you reach your age and mine, because we'll be the chaps that don't get the ventilator. But what about this point that Jerry made? Seems to me a very powerful one, that we've realized, or for the moment we realize, whether we continue to is still open to question, that the people who are actually important in our society are not the people who are most richly rewarded and lionized and given awards and titles and so on. In other words, the stockbroker, the banker and the great industrialist is much less important than the nurse or the doctor or the technician or the man that's collecting your bins or the man that's delivering your essentials. It's a world turned upside down, isn't it?
It is indeed, and of course the situation's got worse in recent years in this country and in the United States, where the salaries of the CEOs of major companies have escalated to 100 times, 300 times normal earnings, whereas the earnings of ordinary workers have hardly gone up at all, even in sectors such as teachers and nurses indeed. They have suffered from that. Perhaps it's interesting, though, to bear in mind there are other countries in the world that are not so unequal, that don't have those huge not only wage differences, but also in social standing. And interestingly, one of them is Japan, which is one of the most egalitarian societies in the world, and has actually been dealing quite well with the coronavirus problem up until now. Interesting, it has a government that calls itself Liberal Democrat, though it's far to the right of what European Liberal Democrats would see as Liberal Democrat.
Interesting. As is the Skype conversation I had with the Reverend Father Frank Gilley, who regular viewers will know is of Italian background himself. I asked him just how Italy, so devastatingly affected by coronavirus, is coping. Let's hear what he had to say.
Well, liberal democracy is the ideology, the dogma the West has embraced. Clearly, its response to the present crisis has been very inadequate. And let us recall the Tory party, which is in power now, is the party of privatization, which is one of the benchmarks of liberal democratic ideology. It's the ideology of a free market or free enterprise, but the crisis is forcing the state, the government, to change its tune. They are having to invest, to inject massive amounts of money into the economy, into the social care system.
Many people believe that neoliberalism had already failed in tackling the lack of growth and the fantastic inequality in the world. So would it be right to be pessimistic about that same system's ability to tackle this pandemic?
The government is forced to change its tune, to recognize that free market capitalism isn't good enough. And also I'm thinking about the libertarian wings of free enterprise. Libertarians believe in a minimal state, in the state as a night watchman. Well, in fact, it's quite clear now the state is more than that. Because unless the state takes an active interest in the welfare of the citizens, the whole social fabric will collapse. So I certainly do believe that the crisis is forcing us to think again about the kind of system, economic, political, philosophical, that we should have. Not the present system. Clearly, it isn't good enough. It is not good enough to tackle the crisis.
I mean, for example, the British Health Secretary, Mike Hancock, he said that Britain was well prepared for this pandemic. Donald Trump went even further than that. But the reality is, open-ended lockdowns, a complete lack of personal protection equipment, and a gross shortage of vital health equipment like ventilators and so on. So what happened to that preparedness? What happened to the budgets of the health systems in Britain, in France, in Spain, in Italy? Why have they been so ill-prepared?
Well, clearly, the Western governments were dragging their feet. Initially, they thought, well, this is happening a long way, far away, amongst different people, a different political system, and it's not going to reach us. In fact, it has. And now we see how, I mean, it's a paradox because, in a way, globalization is failing as well, because all the governments are shutting down their frontiers. They're retrenching behind the national barriers instead of looking at, the really international solidarity. But so it's a terrible thing, really. The Western governments have failed. They were too slow to react. They believe that the crisis belonged to some strange, different people, different nations, whereas in fact it doesn't. It affects us all. We can all die. We can all be destroyed by this virus. So, and Italy, I think I'm originally Italian, of course. Italy is an example of how things have gone disastrously wrong. But I have to say, Italy doesn't have a good record of being organized. But the other countries, even France, which boasts of some sort of preeminence, cultural, and they try to even politically, in Europe now that Britain has copped out of it, and even France is not doing well. So, funnily enough, the only people who are doing well are the Germans. Why is that? I'm not so sure, but the Germans are always good at organization, aren't they?
We used to say that East Germany was the best of the socialist countries, but mainly because they were German. Leaving that point aside, Dr. Ranjit Brar, you're a vascular surgeon. You're working at the front line in the National Health Service, speaking here, of course, in a personal capacity. But how do you account for the point that the Reverend Frank made there, that the time that was available from the outbreak until it hitting Britain, for example, was really quite a substantial period of time, yet not much appears to have been done in that time, at least from looking in from the outside. How do you see it as an insider?
I think that's an accurate assessment, unfortunately, George. We know that, well, we watched in the news this episode unfold really since November, certainly since December. And we are aware now that the Chinese, in fact, contacted the British government and other governments around the world as early as January, just to share information and say what a serious problem they'd been facing and a serious problem that governments around the world would be facing too. So we did have time to prepare ourselves. Initially, our government and the US government were very interested in cheap propaganda point scoring against the Chinese. rather than prepare ourselves, we made great play in our media of saying this was a totalitarian society, a repressive society. They'd repressed the doctors who tried to raise the alarm, etc., etc. But if we look actually at what China achieved, they really worked a miracle. They worked a miracle in terms of just recognizing, it's not a straightforward and wouldn't be an everyday occurrence in our health system to recognize a totally new virus and a totally new outbreak just based on a cluster of respiratory infections. They characterized this genome, they shared it with the world, they worked on protocols of antiviral and antimalarial medication which actually helped to suppress the infection. They threw up entirely new hospitals. They were able to mobilize the full resources of their state, of their economy, of their medical system, and recognize the shortcomings very rapidly of existing infection control protocols and put in place adequate and effective measures to protect their army of healthcare workers who came as secondary workers to the area and who've now gone home again, and not one of them, not one of those secondary group of medics who came to help in Wuhan caught the infection. Wow. If you contrast that with our own preparation, it's been woeful. I mean, it's quite clear that initially the plan from Boris Johnson, as advised by Dominic Cummings and others, was essentially to protect the economy and let it run through the population. And in the words, now disputed, but the words which came out in the Sunday Times, and not my words, of Dominic Cummings, protect the economy, and if a few pensioners die, so be it. And really that reflects an underlying ethos, not just of the Conservative government, but of so-called liberal democracy itself. Because at the heart of liberal democracy rests really capitalism, okay, as an economic system. And capitalism as an economic system, we're encouraged to believe, is unchallenged and unchallengeable. And they're reflective of the underlying economic ethos of the last 40 years at least of government. And that came about, I don't want to speak too long, but that came about precisely at the time when the Keynesian consensus was unraveling. And the Keynesian consensus was a time when these enormous wage differentials were deliberately sacrificed by capitalism, and they were sacrificed to preserve their entire system of exploitation, because it was a period when, after the First World War, when great imperial nations who had divided the globe amongst them had fought essentially, and people argue about what's the cause of the First World War, but the fundamental underlying economic cause, they divided the globe up amongst themselves. But after the First World War and the interim and the Second World War, workers came back and said, no more, we demand a right to a decent life and an end to this slaughter and carnage. And it was precisely for those reasons that a generation of housing, health, social safety net was known in Britain and throughout Europe certainly, and even to an extent in America.
Well, I was born into that era, and my children, alas, are being born during the period of its destruction. I was born into an area where you could expect a job. You could leave a job one day and start a job the next day. You could count on a health service and an education service and free universities and so on. None of that exists at the moment, though this crisis may indeed precipitate these big questions coming back onto the table. We'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, here in London, but discussing the truly global pandemic cutting its swathe through people all over the world, but wondering about the political and economic implications of it all. Has liberal democracy, as it likes to call itself, the norm of the capitalist world, in other words, has it uniquely failed? Has it failed precisely because of its own internal characteristics? And if so, will people still want to cling on to such a discredited set of assumptions as they have hitherto? One man who's a stalwart defender of the status quo, a former soldier and psychologist, is Mike Yardley. I spoke to him on the Skype earlier. Many people would say that neoliberalism had already failed in tackling lack of growth and fantastic inequality around the world. So Would it be right to be pessimistic about the system's ability to tackle this pandemic?
Well, I'm a supporter of democracy, but I think this is immensely challenging to liberal democracy. And if you look at what is happening and some of the responses, they are extraordinary. In the UK and also in the USA, the government have committed themselves to spending vast sums of money that's almost beyond comprehension. And the consequence of that will be both obviously economic, but political too. Firstly, on the economic front, we will see not recession, but almost certainly depression as a consequence of these vast amounts of money. What we may see is extreme inflation. We may see all sorts of undesirable economic consequence. Now, as that happens, and as you also see in the USA, for example, the unemployment rate vastly going up, there is going to be a social consequence, and from that, a political consequence. So I would say that that situation, taking this situation forward, would favor less democratic styles of government, whether those be styles on the left or the right. So I would see this empowering both Marxists and the far right potentially. That would be my analysis. Meantime, at the moment, the government seems to have broad support of people, particularly in the UK. I can't speak for the US at the moment because I'm not there. But I do think another undesirable consequence of what's going on at the moment is the political polarization that we've seen in recent years that's been so apparent since the election of Trump, with Brexit in the UK. I think that polarization will be increased. So I think the psychological effect of what's happening will be to increase polarization and therefore potentially to move away from what we have called liberal democracy.
I mean, Italy is a case in point, isn't it? The Italians, the French, the Spanish, the British, the Americans, they have all failed, even though in every case, but the British case especially, we had such ample time to prepare. Indeed, the British Health Secretary, Mike Hancock, said that we were well prepared. Well, it doesn't look like that now, does it?
Well, I think you raised some interesting points here. Firstly, this is far from the first pandemic. As far as I can gather, there have been half a dozen major pandemics in the last 100 years, at least. I mean, 1918, 1919, the so-called Spanish flu, which wasn't necessarily Spanish in origin, that may have killed as many as 50 million people worldwide. Then after the Second World War, certainly in the UK, and indeed it was elsewhere as well, there was the 1951 pandemic, which in some cities, in Liverpool notably, had greater casualties than the Spanish flu. In 57 and 58, there was another major pandemic. And then again in 1968, there was the so-called Hong Kong flu. And in the UK, something like 80,000 people, I believe, died as a result of that. With the 57-58 pandemic, I think the death toll was more than 30,000. So those were vast numbers, similar or exceeding the numbers we may be seeing now. That does, of course, then prompt a question. When we have had these pandemics in the past, and we've also had things like foot and mouth disease and swine flu, alerts over bird flu of one sort or another, why hadn't we done more to prepare for these situations? And I think that is a question that people will, when the dust settles, if that's the right thing to say, when the dust settles, they will ask that question of government, and not just of government, but of the scientific and medical establishment. Because I don't think that we are. Quite clearly, we have not been adequately prepared for what's happening. A lot of stuff's happening now. They're trying to create a vaccine. The problem with a vaccine is it's not just making the vaccine, but it has to be proven safe before you use it. There's a major shortage of ventilators, which is a constant subject on the news. Well, there are various companies addressing that. Whether they get those ventilators to the people that need them in time is another matter, of course. We're building hospitals. A lot of comment was made by how quickly the Chinese were able to build their hospitals because of their style of government. Well, the UK has managed to build the new Nightingale Hospital, a massive facility in London, in short order too. But the upshot of this is people will come back and say, why were we not better prepared? Because quite clearly, we weren't as well prepared as any logical person who'd looked at the history of this could have seen. That is a question.
Well, Jonathan, you and I as EastEnders, we know that the XL Conference Centre had in fact already been built for many years. The government didn't build it. All they did was put beds and screens into an empty hall. But as a Liberal Democrat, you must be alarmed at Mike's thesis or hypothesis that actually the centre cannot hold, and that the centre is utterly discredited by these events, and that either the left or the right will be the beneficiaries of it. Does that keep you awake at night?
Well, I would agree that the centre is under huge pressure and has been for some time. I wouldn't accept your thesis as it's discredited as such. But what we've seen is the rise of populism and of forces of the right and of the far left in some cases, which have attacked the ideas of the political ideas of liberal democracy as well as the economic ideas that we've discussed. But this happened long before coronavirus appeared on the scene, and it's been happening in various parts of the world. And I covered as a journalist in the 1980s various wars in South America, and then the democratization of countries like Argentina and Brazil and El Salvador and so on. But what we're seeing now is the movement going back in the other direction. So you've got people like Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, who is lauding the dictatorship of the 1960s. You've got Duterte in the Philippines, similarly stamping on human rights, stamping on ideas, the philosophical ideas of liberal democracy. Because let's remember, although the term liberal democracy has in a sense been hijacked by the right-wing libertarian economic liberals, the neoliberals, the idea of liberal democracy as a philosophy or as a political ideology is much more on consensus, tolerance, diversity, pluralism, which is, yes, it's a very soft sort of ideology. And I think the problem is that it is proving difficult to resist the pressure from the hard ideologies that have been rising up, including here in Europe, not just with neo-Nazi groups, but even now with mainstream governments like Fidesz in Hungary. Just the other day, Viktor Orban basically got the right to rule by decree, all freedoms out of the window. Anyone can be picked up and sent to prison if they are deemed to somehow be not following the rule of the state. And that's really, really worrying. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we could be on the cusp of going back to a 1930s situation where the right will be rising fast, and of course there'll be protests and other forces from the left combating that. And I think we could see, once the coronavirus problem is out of the way, as it will be at some stage, then a real conflict between these ideologies, as there was in the 1930s.
Jerry, I know that you and I have different ideas about what's left and what's right, but China and Russia aren't going to collapse. They're increasingly marching in step. Some of us adhere more to them than to other forces in the world. But are you worried, like Jonathan is, about the potential rise of the far right on the other side, I would say, of the political spectrum?
Indeed, the far right, as he mentioned in Hungary, Orban's government is your absolute prototype of a fascist dictatorship. It's not there yet. It's not a fascist dictatorship yet, but it's strongly moving in that direction. And I would admit, explicitly anti-Semitic, and explicitly anti-Semitic that's supported by Netanyahu in Israel. So there's your contradiction for yourself. There is a bit of a difference about Bolsonaro Bolsonaro is a defender of neoliberal capitalism still, and he's faced a revolt by his own local governors in the regions. In fact, 200 million out of the 210 million have said, no, you can't run business as usual in this situation. But
well, what about the United States?
The United States.
If the United States is in depression next week, which it could be, indeed with more than 10 million unemployed already, and that curve going to double or more, you could say that the United States is back in the 1930s, in which case will an FDR emerge, or will Trump, I don't know, become Mussolini?
All right. Well, there's the governor of New York who's emerging as your JDR, I suppose. He's sounding more sort of leftist than
this is Andrew Cuomo. You think the Democrats might pick him as their nominee?
I think it's a bit too late for that, but no, nonetheless, he has emerged as the figure. And of course, the United States, I would say, is in great danger of drifting to the far right because of the fact that it doesn't even have a social democratic party. It has no party of the left as such. And it is in big danger. But ideologically, I think that the ruling class have a big trump card in their hands, because they can say, look, you mustn't resist this too strongly, because if you do resist it too strongly, you will get a nightmare society like under Joseph Stalin and Kim Jong-un in North Korea. I would mention in that respect that in the 15 years before 1914, that appalling dictator, the Tsar, he executed 1,000 people. In the years 1936 to 38, our good socialist Joseph Stalin managed 1,000 a day. That's what he managed. And people that say that that's the society you have to look forward to don't know what communism is, and don't know what human equality is, and don't know what we have to aspire for. And I don't think you'll ever inspire the cleaners and the nurses and the oppressed of this country to accept that is a society we have to look forward to. China, on the other hand, well, you can say it's never was as oppressive as that. But nonetheless, I would say China is a full-blown capitalist country now. You have Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos is giving hundreds of millions of dollars for the coronavirus. But Jack Ma is also the billionaire, China's billionaire, and he's given his hundreds of billions of dollars. He's giving it to Africa.
He's given much more, actually, than Bezos and Gates combined. Ranjit, let me just put what is, for me, Jerry's most important point, that China is just another capitalist country. That can't be true, can it? Because if it was, its performance would be as bad as all the rest of them.
Thanks, George. If I could just very quickly come back to this central point of liberal democracy, I think we've got to be very careful of these terms, because they've given to themselves the cloak of being liberal, reasonable, in the middle, centre ground, and therefore they have to be the dominant voice. But demos, kratos, we know means rule of the people. Rule of the people. Coming to China, China unquestionably has a large penetration of capitalism into the market. It absolutely does. You can't argue with those economic facts. It's got the second largest number of billionaires after America in the world. That's all true. But its state system, its system of rule, still is bequeathed to it by a popular revolutionary process which overthrew colonialism and established a local democracy for the Chinese people. Still, they have 80 million members in their Communist Party who are recruited from people who are, they would be the people who are professional, have proved themselves in society, have proved themselves to represent working people. So the administration of China is very different from just the economic system alone, and they showed how they were able to direct the economy to solve an urgent problem that was facing the Chinese people. And that's very different from here. It's precisely the relations of production, the alienation of even the medical professionals on the front line from the decisions about how to deploy resources, let alone recruit more resources into the NHS. How can we build another hospital? The Chinese published a beautiful document about summating their experience of fighting COVID, which included such things as the arrangement of the fever clinic. It sounds like such a straightforward thing to say, but it was certain entrances totally separate from the rest of the hospitals, certain hospitals separate from the general population, the right levels of protective gear for different procedures. All of these things we've proven totally unable, slow to look at China with humility and say we can learn from their experience. There's an inherent complex of superiority, complex of inherently believing the Chinese must be lying, which is drip-fed down from the leadership to the rest of the scientific and academic, and I'm afraid medical community, that we're getting over. But then slow to implement precisely because actually we don't have the economic resources to implement what clearly makes clinical sense.
As Dr. Ranjit puts it, Jonathan, it isn't actually a very nice, cuddly system, this liberal democracy. You are very nice and cuddly, but the system of a tiny handful, less than 2 hands full, of billionaires owning as much wealth as half of the world, and when a pandemic comes along, our societies go down like skittles in a bowling alley. You said you rejected my idea that it was discredited, but it sounds a bit discredited to me.
I think basically we have to accept, or at least I would argue, that liberal democracy as an ideology or as a term was hijacked in the late 1980s with the decline and then the collapse of European communism. You got people in the United States, in particular with George Bush, father and son, promoting what they saw as liberal democracy. Francis Fukuyama arguing famously, the end of history now, there is only liberal democracy and that's how the world's going to be. And it's the American model. And I think we do have to distinguish between the American version of liberal democracy and those countries that follow that line and what we might call a European model, which is much more close to
Italian, Spanish, French,
closer to social democracy and an acceptance that there needs to be a balance between the market and corporate, social responsibility. So I think that distinction is important to be made. So that's why I don't believe that the European version is yet discredited as such. But I fear that Britain has been going, under the Conservatives, much too far towards the American model. And on this issue, for example, of why the disaster of the pandemic being dealt with now, there was an exercise in 2016, because as has been mentioned earlier, there are pandemics cyclically. And there was an exercise in 2016 to see how would Britain deal with the pandemic, and it was shown that the NHS was not prepared enough to be able to do it. And did the government take the necessary steps? No, it didn't. That's certainly a discredited form of liberal democracy, if you wish, but I would call it conservatism.
Yeah, but much of the ideology that lies behind the prevailing orthodoxy in the form, in the British form certainly, and the American, is a kind of libertarianism, that the state should be small, that the state should be the night watchman rather than the regulator right in the center of things in the way that the Chinese state is. So that, for example, you had a horse racing festival at Cheltenham in the early, but not that early, stages of this pandemic. 40, 60, 80,000 people went there over the course of 9 days, and it acted as a super spreader. Now, the argument against cancelling it was a libertarian one. Well, freedom of action and the people's right to do what they like, the state shouldn't be so draconian and so on. You see the point I'm making? You see the tension between this liberal democracy and the country doing what its political leadership needs to be done, but is unable to have its will carried through.
Well, certainly the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is a libertarian. That is his basic ideology. But I certainly wouldn't call him a Liberal Democrat. And I think that has been this basically takeover by so much of the political space in Britain by people who have accepted the idea of the free market economy. But if you look at, for example, the man who was responsible for the report which led to the National Health Service, free education, etc., was a Liberal, Beveridge. And that's, I think, to save liberal democracy, people like myself, I think, have to stand up and say, what our liberal democracy is a Beveridge type of liberal democracy, and we must cooperate with members of the Labour Party and other forces, progressive forces in this country to promote that, because otherwise the libertarians are going to kill off liberal democracy by their, I think, completely wrong interpretation of it.
I did ask, actually, Father Frank Gilley, whose earlier contribution was tremendous, I thought. I did ask him about what he thought the future was likely to be. Let's hear it.
Maybe if you consider possibly also the failure of, in some ways, of the left, which is not really, I think if Jeremy Corbyn had been Prime Minister, he would be doing a better job than Boris Johnson. But on the whole, the left is not very brilliant here. So we need possibly a third way, a different way, a new worldview, something which transcends both right and left. I personally believe that we need an ethical state, an ethical dimension into social affairs. St. Thomas Aquinas said the purpose of the state is to safeguard the common good, the good of all. Now, it's quite clear to me that liberal democracy, free market capitalism, is not good at that. And the left has not been doing too well in, if we look at the failure of the Soviet Union and Eastern European states and so on. So we need a third way. We need a new vision, a new purpose. And maybe visionaries, people of faith, people who really can transcend the personal jealousies of a personal selfishness, we can actually show the way ahead, some of us, inshallah.
So what's next? Let's assume this horror lasts for another year. What comes after that? What next for the liberal democracies?
Well, look, I don't have a crystal ball, but one thing is quite clear to me. Liberal democracy, capitalism are failing, so we need another way.
They're always looking, Dr. Ranjit, for a third way. Tony Blair famously, Mussolini, fascism itself posed itself in Italy in the 20s as a third way. The National Health Service in which you work, would you say that that is in microcosm socialism? How would you compare the idea of a National Health Service to the kind of society that many people might start demanding after this is over? After all, in 1945, thanks to the Beveridge Report, people emerged from the war and dumped Winston Churchill out of Downing Street because they were determined that after the privations of the 1930s, the struggle, epic struggle of the war, that they would not go back to what they had before.
Thanks, George. I think it's a reasonable analogy. The National Health Service, in a way, in a country which is losing its religion, has become recognised by all as something that all working people and the vast majority of our fellow countrymen have a great deal of faith in. It touches all of our lives. It changes radically our life chances. I know myself, if I got a terrible infection and needed treatment intensive care, that the bill for that care would run into tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's not something that I or my family could afford without the National Health Service. And so anyone who's worked in a country where they have no National Health Service, where they have no system of social support, where they say people really crushed in their life chances and actually have their lives curtailed by preventable diseases for the sake of a few pennies and a drip, anyone who has seen that or reckoned with it cannot help but think there has to be a level at which society must take the wealth generated by working people. All wealth comes from the labour, from work of working people. And I think it's reasonable then to expect that, one, we should be allowed to work and have a job, but two, in return, we should have a certain degree of sophistication and security in our lives that allows us to reach our potential and truly be all we can be. If we're crushed by poverty, unemployment, homelessness, hopelessness, despair, we see all the problems of society that we see everywhere, endemic in our society now. I think no realistic change is going to come. A real third way requires, whatever people call it, some way for the working people of Britain, in our case, of the wider world, to come together and form. I think a new body has to be formed, and I'm trying to be involved in that process of forming a body which attracts the working people of Britain, that can put in place a society which really serves them, and not an illusory image, a flag given to them, which actually they're waving the flag of their exploiter and not the flag of the real British working class. We need to create such a movement, and I think the British people will be forced to. They're being pushed into a position where they can do nothing else.
Well, I live in quite a posh street by the grace of God and some hard work, and at 8 o'clock on Thursday nights, the entirety of my street is outside, clapping, cheering, roaring on the workers, your colleagues in the National Health Service. I do think we're onto something here, that unpredictably, the biggest challenge to the existing order turned out to be a health challenge, and that health challenge left the existing order looking pretty naked indeed. The emperor has no clothes. That's just my point of view. I thank you for joining me on Kalima Horra this evening. I've been George Galloway. You've been a marvellous audience.